I want to begin with a quote from a book called Living Buddha, Living Christ. It's by Thich Nhat Hanh. I'll have something to say about him in a moment, but it kind of sets up my thesis, I guess. And he writes, different religious traditions can engage in dialogue with one another in a true spirit of ecumenism. Dialogue can be fruitful and enriching if both sides are truly open. If they really believe that there are valuable elements in each other's tradition and that they can learn from one another, they will also rediscover many valuable aspects of their own tradition, through such an encounter. Peace will be a beautiful flower blooming on this field of experience. So that's kind of where I'm headed with this, because that's been my experience. This lesson, talk, testimony maybe, we call How the Buddha Helps Me Be a Better Christian. And it is very much in a kind of a dialogue between those two that has helped me kind of be in a much better spiritual space. The author, Thich Nhat Hanh, is that a name you're familiar with at all? Okay. Zen Buddhist monk, kind of known as the father of mindfulness in the West, is known for a practice called engaged Buddhism. And so he was an activist. As a matter of fact, I think if you Google one person that MLK actually nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, it was Thich Nhat Hanh. He promoted a sort of deep listening and nonviolent social change, which is very much kind of in the tradition of MLK and Gandhi, really. And so he is kind of, I guess, my spiritual teacher in this sort of realm. So I spend Sundays as often as I can here at Wilshire Baptist Church. I'm happy to say, though I grew up in Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and never would have thought Baptist would be attached to my spirituality. But also I never realized that on Fridays I would be part of something called a Blooming Hearts or Blooming Strengths Sangha, which is a Zen Buddhist community in the Plum Village tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. It's an online group that I discovered after some search. Now, a Sangha is a community of believers. Right? It's sort of the ecclesia within the church tradition. It's their church. And when we gather on Fridays, we gather with one another, and everyone greets, or before they speak, or after someone speaks, we put palms together and we bow. Right? And that's significant. And I know that when they're bowing to me, they're not bowing to Barry Preston. The idea here is what the bow is to what they would say is the Buddha nature in everyone. Right? We could sort of correlate that to the image of God with which everyone is created. And so it's not my historical manifestation, it's that Holy Spirit within me that they're bowing to, and that we bow to one another, and it's almost kind of like an invocation, right? It's a respect of that sort of essential nature, however much it might be messed up at a given time. But maybe it's also sort of an invocation that may also sort of be drawn out, right? The best in all of us be drawn out. Which takes me back to Wednesday, November 6, 2024. Which that was the day after the last presidential election. Now, a couple of weeks before that, my wife, in her infinite wisdom, and said, Barry, on the day after the election, it might be a good idea for you to set up a meeting with a good friend of yours who happens to be a therapist. And she said, whatever, okay.
Better a bartender,
Well, it was a good idea. We got to spend some time sort of mutually supporting one another on that day. But what happened on that day on my way driving to see my friend was that I found myself at a railroad crossing, stopped at a railroad crossing. And while I was there, I looked over. I was just driving to see my friend. I looked over, there was a car right next to me. There was a young man wearing a cap. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't see exactly what was on the cap, but here's where my mind went. That's a red cap, and it has certain letters on it. And in the midst of that thought, without any conscious choice, I felt anger. Not just anger, resentment. On this person I've never met and didn't actually see the hat, right? And it was like powerful. I mean, it was a bodily response of what I was feeling. So it was a good thing that I met with my friend, and it was also a good thing that I had a gathering with a Buddhist Sangha on Friday and Wilshire on Sunday. You know, through the midst of all of those, there was kind of a sense of equanimity, I think, that I was able to achieve. But nonetheless, in reflection on that, it's like, where does that come from? Like, where does that just emerge from? Feeling as though it's completely outside of my choice. Well, I think of my mom, and I know that she would have been happy that I was at Wilshire on Sunday. She might have been a little bit more than baffled and maybe a little concerned that I was at something called a Buddhist Sangha on Friday. She was raised Church of Christ. And even though at one birthday, I told her the main thing that I really wanted for my birthday was a set of yoga tapes. She didn't get it. Later she said, because the exercise is fine, but I don't know what it might do to your mind. So I hope she's okay with me actually doing this. I trust that maybe she is. So to contextualize this, if I haven't told you this before, at 12 years old, I went through what we called pastor's class, which was preparation for baptism. All the youth at Central Christian Church went through pastor's class, at the end of which all your questions should be answered about God and Jesus and the Trinity and salvation. And we were ushered up to the front, made our confession of faith, and got baptized, the week afterwards. And everybody did it, except for one person, me. And I had this conversation with both my parents. My father, who thought it was just the right thing to do, because that's, socially, it's just the right thing to do. My mother was concerned about my soul. And I told her, I said, something about it just didn't feel right. I couldn't name it. It just didn't feel right. And so I didn't get baptized till 5 years later when I was 17. And quite frankly, it still didn't feel right, but I had a very pragmatic reason. You see, I'd been asked to apply for a youth leadership position in the High Plains area, and that was pretty cool. But you had to be a member of a church, and so I thought, well, pragmatically, maybe I can figure this out later. Maybe it'll feel right afterwards. So I did that, but it didn't. So I did the same that any sane person would do in a case where they just weren't clear about their religion and spirituality. They would go to college and major in religion studies, right? Which, gave me a lot more to think about. After which I still wasn't quite where I hoped I would be, so I did what any sane person would do. I went to seminary so I could get all my answers. Anybody who has any understanding of seminary has got to be laughing inside right now that that's where the answers are going to come from. And 3 years later, right? 3 years later, okay, I was still not particularly feeling right about it, but I'd taken out some grants that were forgivable only if I actually got ordained. And so it seemed like the pragmatic thing to do. I just went ahead and got ordained as a minister, thought I'd do some church work for some years. And I did that, and it never still felt quite right. That robe just didn't fit quite right. But the seed that was missing in all of this had been planted back at college. Because I'd taken a course in Buddhism. And I didn't know it at the time, and it took me a few years to kind of connect the dots. But something was planted there that really sort of eventually, I think, flowered. Now, Joseph Campbell is a comparative religion scholar, was a comparative religion scholar, and he says that a vital spiritual tradition has 4 functions. All right? One function is psychological. It should help us manage the changes that we naturally go through in life, from childhood to adolescence, from adolescence to young adulthood, so on and so forth. The religion should provide a means that we can adjust to those changes. It has a sociological function. That's where a lot of our conversation is these days, right? How do you live with other human beings who sometimes agree, who sometimes don't agree, right? It has a cosmological function. Jim mentioned this, I think, last week. It's like a picture of our relationship to the universe and the environment. Right? How are we supposed to relate to these outside forces? To some degree, I had some success in my experience with Christianity in those first 3, but the 4th one is where I ran into issues. And the 4th function of a vital religious community is cultivating a relationship with the deep, awesome mystery that underlies all of the above. Right? The mystery. That's where, for me, something was missing and didn't just feel right. I didn't feel that sort of connected relationship. That, however, is what the combination of my Friday Sangha and Sunday morning church has kind of begun to I think, yield benefits for me spiritually. So what the Friday Sangha looks like is that we gather together, we bow, we have greetings, and this is followed by what's called a Dharma talk. Dharma in the Hindu and Buddhist tradition is the sort of authentic teachings of the tradition, right? So scripture and tradition from the Christian perspective, but there's a Dharma talk by one of the elders or leaders of the group, and then there is about a 20-minute meditation, sometimes guided, sometimes largely silent. Followed by some Sangha sharing and a kind of brief meditation and departure. Now, the Dharma talk, the sharing, the gatherings, that's familiar to me from my Christian tradition. What wasn't familiar to me is 20 minutes of meditation, of stopping and listening deeply. And I should say at least 20 minutes. It can go on longer. And so what happens in Zen meditation is that, it's in some sense it's simple, not easy, right? You sit on a chair, on the floor, in a dignified position, spine as straight as you can be. In this tradition, you don't get overly stressed out about whether the position is perfect. Some Zen traditions, you really do. This one, you don't. The main thing is that you're able to enter into this kind of meditative awareness through this experience. And there are 2 main aspects to it. One, you stop, right? You're on the hamster wheel of life. You gotta stop. For many of us, that's the biggest challenge, right? Second, you listen deeply. You stop. And you listen deeply, right? Notice it doesn't say speak. You listen deeply. There's an anchor for all of this. It's usually the breath. Because as soon as you sit down, start trying this, if any of you have done any kind of meditation like this, first thing that comes up is the mind goes crazy. They call it monkey mind. It's like a monkey jumping from tree to tree. Not just like a monkey, it's like a crazed monkey. And not just like a crazed monkey, it's a drunken crazed monkey who has been stung by a bee. That's our mind. Here and there and everywhere. But the practice is not to resist it. It's like, that's going to happen. Just like my feeling when I was at the railroad track. It's going to come up. The idea is, how do you respond to it? And with meditation, the practice is you always come back, in this sense, to your breath, to your center, right? And that practice in and of itself, the belief is, and I believe this to be true, it yields certain fruits, right? Some of them are well documented, and anybody who's sort of done any of this work or has sort of familiar with some of the third wave psychology movements, the relationship between meditation and mindfulness practices and lowering stress, increasing overall well-being, potentially strengthening relationships. There have been a number of studies, and there's reason to believe that that is the case, that it's effective in that way. But that's the thing is, that's not the purpose of any of it, not from a Zen perspective. The purpose of it from the kind of spiritual Zen perspective is liberation. That is liberation from suffering. Suffering not only for me as an individual, but for all living beings. Like everyone you bow to is Buddha nature, is Christ nature. Your meditation is intended for the liberation of suffering of all beings. Okay, sounds good, right? Now, but there's always a part of me that's kind of like, okay, I'm sitting around focusing on your breath, actually going to impact what, we would hope to impact on like October 18th, right? Is social justice and social change actually going to be impacted by me spending a considerable amount of time sitting and breathing? And Thich Nhat Hanh and a number of other sort of activists in this tradition would suggest, well, yes, it does. Because it's not about strategy. It's about who we are being when we go to the march. Right? So Thich Nhat Hanh has a concept that it sort of brings together a number of the ideas of Buddhism, of the Dharma seals that they call them, the sort of three essential teachings of Buddhism, which are impermanence, no self, and nirvana. Right, so all of that. He sort of brings it down and says, there's one idea. It's called inner being. He says, if you're a poet, you will clearly see that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow, and without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud is not there, the sheet of paper cannot be here either. So we can say the cloud and the paper inter-are. Inter-being is a word that's not in the dictionary yet, but I hope that it will be soon, he writes. And he extends that from the exercise with the paper to the food that we eat, and to our ancestors, and to those who come afterwards. And he's like, if you look deeply, right, we inter-are. We are completely dependent and interdependent on all of creation, right? For them, the image of God, the sort of Buddha nature, resides in everything. No thing is another sort of teaching in that when you get to a point, I'm not there yet, right? You begin to realize there is no separate thing, that we are all one body, right? That might sound familiar as an image from the New Testament as well. We are all one body. But it goes beyond the Sangha. For them, it's for every living being throughout all of creation. So that's the kind of sense that he calls for us to have when we engage in sort of social movements. There's this sort of powerful story that he tells about going on a peace march. And he talks about the nature in which the people on the peace march were marching and doing what they were doing. And he said, I looked around and the right words were on the signs about bringing peace to the world and being nonviolent. But he said, as I looked in some of the faces of the youth, I didn't see peace. He said what they were bringing, regardless of the beautiful words on the sign, was anger. Almost to the point of, one could say, violence in the name of peace. He said, so despite of their beautiful words, they weren't bringing those words into what they hoped to do. To kind of push this home, he has a poem called Call Me By My True Names. I think this gets to the essence of what troubles me about this, but also what he's trying to do. And it goes like this. If I can find it. Do not say that I'll depart tomorrow, because even today I still arrive. Look deeply. I arrive in every second to be a bud on a spring branch, to be a tiny bird with wings still fragile, learning to sing in my new nest, to be a caterpillar in the heart of a flower, to be a jewel hiding itself in a stone. I still arrive in order to laugh and cry, in order to fear and to hope. The rhythm of my heart is the birth and death of all that are alive. I am the mayfly metamorphosing on the surface of the river, and I am the bird which, when spring comes, arrives in time to eat the mayfly. I am the frog swimming happily in the clear pond, and I am also the grass snake who, approaching in silence, feeds itself on the frog. I'm the child in Uganda, all skin and bones, my legs as thin as bamboo sticks. And I am the arms merchant selling deadly weapons to Uganda. I'm a member of the Politburo with plenty of power in my hands, and I am the man who has to pay his debt of blood to my people, dying slowly in a forced labor camp. My joy is like spring, so warm it makes flowers bloom in all walks of life. My pain is like a river of tears, so full it fills the four oceans. Please call me by my true names, so I can hear all my cries and laughs at once, so I can see that my joy and pain are one. Please call me by my true names so I can wake up, and so the door of my heart can be left open, the door of compassion. And so finally, in response again to the youth that he was on the peace march with, he says about the roots of anger. Anger is rooted in our lack of understanding of ourselves and of the causes, deep-seated as well as immediate, that brought about this unpleasant state of affairs. Anger is also rooted in desire, pride, agitation, and suspicion. The primary roots of our anger are in ourselves. Our environment and other people are only secondary. It's not difficult for us to accept the enormous damage brought about by a natural disaster such as an earthquake or a flood. But when damage is caused by another person, we don't have much patience. We know that earthquakes and floods have causes, and we should see that the person who has precipitated our anger also has reasons, deep-seated and immediate, for what he has done. For instance, someone who speaks badly to us may have been spoken in exactly the same way when they were a child or just the day before. When we see and understand these kinds of causes, we can begin to free from our anger. I'm not saying that someone who viciously attacks us should not be disciplined. But what is most important is we first take care of the seeds of negativity in ourselves. Then if someone needs to be helped or disciplined, we will do it out of compassion, not anger and retribution. If we genuinely try to understand the suffering of another person, we're more likely to act in a way that will help him overcome his suffering and confusion, and will help all of us. Those are the teachings that I find myself needing to hear over and over again. And in my desire to both be sort of responsible and responding to the call of a passage that we had some weeks ago about justice, tempering that with kindness and humility. They seem to be, they inter-are. But the spiritual part of this, one without the other, just doesn't work for me. And that sensibility is kind of the missing piece that I found that, all those years ago, I wasn't quite feeling right. And now I do. So, what I pray is that next time, I find myself at that traffic light and my thoughts go in certain directions about the person that may or may not be wearing the kind of hat that I assume he is. That while I'm going to work really hard to oppose the policies and the worldview that that person holds, that I can at the same time sort of bow to that person in the image of God that I believe, however hard it is for me to see, is there. And hopefully that will temper the way I go about trying to change that person's approach, person's policies, that person's mind. That's kind of where I wanted to go with that. And happy to sort of open it up for questions and comments, or I could play around with, my mystical interpretation of the Roman road and the 7 sacraments. So whatever you guys want to do, it's good with me.
Do you see yourself, and this is not really, I guess, religious way to
Yeah.
do you see yourself these days more as a Buddhist or a Christian, or a Buddhist Christian or a Christian Buddhist?
So as I started out, I'm a dabbler. I dabble. I mean, I could have done this sort of same thing with Hinduism and Taoism, although I have a little bit more bona fides with Buddhism because I'm part of a Buddhist community. I almost can't with integrity call myself a Buddhist, right? It's kind of the adjective that I bring into myself as fundamentally Christian. But it's an interesting question, because if somebody asked me, because it's so contextual, if somebody asked me, are you a Christian? I almost have to ask them, well, so when you ask that question, what do you think a Christian is? Because I might have to say, I'm not that, right? I used to have this issue with just, do you believe in God, right? I'm going to say, well, tell me about the God you believe in, and I'll tell you if that's what I would affirm or not. So it's like, it's complicated. And I bet if somebody that I hadn't met before, I'd be sort of interested to see how I'd respond to that. I know I would pause, right? I wouldn't just say, if they say, are you a Christian? I wouldn't just, I'd pause. I'd kind of have to contextualize it. And that's just sort of where I am. Others are much more comfortable kind of just saying yes, just a full-throated yes, and then see where the conversation goes from there. Yeah. I tend to approach it from the other kind of, let's talk about that question first.
I have 2 comments. One was, I like that, because what I heard this week was, what we're not. I'm not a Christian nationalist Christian. So there's the anti-Christian nationalism moniker that's right now sitting in the place of that other adjective. And the other thing I wanted to just say was just, it's really fascinating how you brought this out. And I love the spiritual journey that you describe, and the level of integrity you attempted to have for many, many years. I remember we spoke.
Yeah, it failed miserably at times, yes.
And I just love the fact that you've been able to pull that up and talk about it at this stage of your life. I have arrived at this place, not from that direction, but rather, and this is for everybody, because we all are going to hurt. We're all going to have physical pain in our life. I just happen to have arrived at a point in chronologically to have a lot of it, and I have an intense amount of it. And so Rhonda, my lovely wife, bought me some meditation cards, and I started using them without any knowledge of this at all. I started learning to meditate, and I appreciated 2 benefits. One is a reduction of anxiety about my pain.
Yep.
And it brought up anger. Yep. A lot of anger.
Yep.
And so I've been dealing with that anger through a therapist, right? Talking, why am I so angry about what's going on with me? And it's came close to mortality and dying.
Yeah.
But this other thing though is, I reached over and touched my wife, and I said, it's helped our relationship because I understood the anger was keeping me from being kind to the people I live with. To the person I live with now. We've been living together for a long time. And it's like, how can I be so unkind? And so it's that kind of wrapped up from a different direction.
Yes.
So it arcs in this cosmology thing.
Yeah,
To me, right?
yeah.
Okay.
And here's what, and to go along with that,
Yeah.
yeah, this actually exists within the Christian tradition.
Exactly.
And so when it sort of where I started was you'll find things about your own tradition that you never kind of knew that was there. Deep meditative kind of silence, what's called oftentimes the prayer of the heart, is very much a part of the Christian tradition. It just wasn't part of my experience. I didn't have that. I have great things and a very affirming, kind of loving community that I grew up in, and youth group was transformative in the way that I felt affirmed, right? And connected with people who just were good people. That was all there, but it was the mystical aspect, that deep mystery that was missing. And, you know, as a tradition, when Christianity became the cool kids on the block back, you know, in what, 5th century Rome, well, even before that, the Desert Fathers began to say, you know, we're getting a little too cozy just with Christianity becoming culturally normative, right? We'll adopt the message of Jesus, the transformative message of Jesus, so that it kind of fits nicely into how we're already living, right? We never did that. And they're saying, you know what? That ain't it. So they went out to the desert. They had to stop and sort of move away and kind of live into very deeply and intentionally, what does it look like if I'm not being formed by culture, but I'm being formed by the message of Christ, right? Now, to me, that was an extra. I mean, I don't want to leave society, right? To me, the message there is to how to take that message of the monastic community and integrate it, right, with what we're doing. I think like Franciscan spirituality, if you have any sort of familiar with that, that's kind of where that lands, right? I mean, it in the 13th century, fascinating thing to look at the Middle Ages. Just before the Protestants came along and did a few good things, but also did some not so good things by throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But you know, there were things going on kind of spiritually, and I would say maybe symbolically as much as, you know, I'll be honest, that are really fascinating. There are sort of 4 monastic movements within, you know, the 13th century that seem to be integrating the kinds of things I'm talking about, right? And so it's really, really interesting. Yeah, Franciscan spirituality. There's that deep, reflective kind of commitment, but is engaged. It's called engaged Buddhism that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about. It's engaged in the world, and it did not make the hierarchy happy when they said, no, we're not just talking about spiritual poverty. Jesus says, actually give your stuff up. I don't think Dominicans like that either.
As you were talking, I was reminded, whether many people don't believe this, I happen to, that the line between a lot of world religions is blurry. That there's a lot of overlap, and while you were talking about these behaviors and the thinking, I was reminded over and over of Jesus. About his teachings and about he behaved and what he wanted us to do and the way he wanted us to treat one another. And it lined up beautifully with what you were describing.
Well, Matthew 5, Luke 6, Matthew 7, I had this in here, but I thought I would run out of time. I mean, Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven, that you may be children, right? This passage is similar, saying, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Do not judge, this is Matthew 7, do not judge, or you too will be judged. From the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank of your own? I think all of those point to that kind of notion of interbeing and be sort of starting from the inside out. So the concern is that engaging in social justice work can either be like the kids going out and saying, give peace a chance, and whacking people over the head to say, don't you get the message? Or Give peace a chance, and you relate to them through compassion, not anger. Now, I'm saying all this, and this is not like I'm there. I feel it every day. It's aspirational spirituality for me, right? But nonetheless, that's where I hear that, and that's where I say, you know what? That's the missing piece. That I can affirm. That feels right. That's what was missing for me. That feels right. And so when you ask me, am I a Christian? In that context, absolutely. Right? So when I look at the New Testament, I see all the teachings of the Gospels particularly. And every time it says Jesus went to pray, I expand that to as many pages as there are words. Right? The amount of prayer time is equal to, we're just not privy to it. Because it's what? It's silent. Or it's between Jesus and when he related to as his Father. Right? But there's as much that I like to look at the New Testament as there's as many pages as there are words and teachings. There's that many of silence, contemplation, and just listening, not speaking, listening to God. So I think we're probably out of time. So thank you for being gracious and patient.